is more efficient in dealing with that than democracy. And that lays up great fears, I think, for those of us who are inherently democratic by nature and want to see a more democratic world. Internationally, I think we are going to see far more intrusion through the internet, greater power of internet bodies. We have got to ask ourselves, I think, will this pandemic stimulate further strength for our existing United Nations institutions, such as the World Health Organization? WHO has a fine record. It's eliminated smallpox. It's monitoring things around the world, but it doesn't have any teeth. It cannot actually require pharmaceutical companies to come together to coordinate their research. It cannot require governments to take certain health measures in order to safeguard their populations. Is this something that we will want to see in the global community? Or is it something that we will want to have those institutions remain very worthy in themselves, but in effect ineffective because they don't have any kind of enforcement power? So on the economic side, I think it is going to be interesting to see if the habit of working at home continues. I think we have seen in this country a massive regional imbalance, which sadly is unlikely to go away as a result of home working, because if you look at the Northeast, a far fewer proportion of people are capable of working at home because they are used to going into the larger factories and places of work than in London and the Southeast, where something like 50% of people in London are actually still capable of working at home and being quite productive. So that regional imbalance is not likely to be changed as a result of the lockdown and people working at home. However, I think it will further stimulate the government, as it's already expressed before the outbreak came, to invest in infrastructure in those regional, comparatively deprived areas. And it may well be that companies themselves decide that they are wanting to get their workforce more capable of doing part of their work at home rather than coming into great collective areas where people are sitting or working cheek by jowl. It may, of course, stimulate in the need to try to find cheaper premises, more companies relocating outside London and the Southeast, where real property is very expensive, and actually moving into some of those other regional areas. And I think we're going to see also probably a shortening of supply lines. I think more and more companies will have been very disorientated by not being able to get access to vital components that they need. And it may well be that that could stimulate shorter supply lines where companies are looking for those parts to be made further down the road rather than abroad or something like that. And we have to ask, well, how practical is that? I think finally, I would say on the economic front, that the fiscal consequences of this are going to be massive. However benign and non-state controlled a government may be in the future, the fact is we are notching up an enormous burden on future generations by the amount that we're spending on this at the present time. And so I think the bad news for us all is that inevitably, even if it's not called austerity, it's more likely to be higher taxes for everybody in a variety of different ways in the years to come, merely to try to recoup some of the enormous amount of money that's having to be spent on this. And very finally, and this is where I'll end, the impact on society and social impact as a whole. Sadly, as is so often the case, and indeed has been the case throughout history, and I go back to the Black Death again, where this was very apparent, the people who suffer most in these crises are the poorer people in society. they are the ones most impacted by the fact that they cannot work, they lose their income, but also, sadly, they are often the ones who suffer physically from a health-wise point more than other people who maybe have the money to look after themselves a little better. So that is going to be a social imperative to try to ensure that in future the impact of such a pandemic is not felt so disproportionately amongst the poorer people in society. And frankly, I sit here terrified about what might happen in India. If that, and they've already started to have cases breaking out in India, when you think of the juxtaposition of human beings in India in every form, whether it's in work or in their congregation, in places or places of worship, the transport, the railways, that is the most terrifying prospect of 1 billion people, over 1 billion people, being very severely affected by this pandemic in a way that, frankly, I don't think any government could control with the constraints that they have in the way India is running itself. And finally, I think that we are going to see a greater human interaction by electronic means. We've already seen that. Today is a manifestation of that. But I think we are going to see more and more of that taking place as people get used to it. More and more people become familiar with Zoom and Skype and other and WhatsApp and such like, and they are going to stick with those means of communication. So it may well be that we see far less travel in the future, and that's even before one talks about the impact of the carbon footprint and the impact on the climate and things of that nature. So I think that is something else that could well have a societal effect as a result of this. So I'm going to leave it there. I think, you know, not leaving on an entirely pessimistic note, we've now had reported that 20 of the 31 provinces of China are now running back almost to normal. Some 80% of migrant workers in China have returned to their factories. Production in some parts of some provinces is now back up to about 90%. And I think the general view is that not just in Europe and the UK, but also in the world as a whole, what we're likely to be seeing is probably a U-shaped rather than a V-shaped recovery. And that U-shaped recovery means that we will hit the lows and we'll stay in the lows for a little while, I mean, matter of months, before we start seeing an upturn again. Clearly, this is only the second time since the Second World War where there has actually been a reduction in global output. That speaks for itself, and we are going to see that impacted very much in the months and years to come. But I think that more and more economists now are looking to the possibility, and I'll put it no more highly than that, that we may begin to see that upturn come about again in 2021. And I think that's something we've all got to pray for. And in the meantime, we must clearly pray for not only our fellow citizens, but for world citizens, that mercifully, I hope, as few people as possible will be really deleteriously affected by this. Thank you very much.